The US government is releasing UFO files, not one file, not one video, not one historical memo. A rolling system of releases, documents, videos, images, audio, historical records, modern reports, military cases, orb sightings, old investigations, new governance structures, and now possibly a long-hidden recording connected to one of the most famous UFO waves in American history. The disclosure story is moving again, but here is the question. Is it moving toward truth or toward a more sophisticated version of control? Because the modern UAP disclosure landscape is no longer just about whether governments have files. We know they have files. It is no longer just about whether military pilots have seen things. We know they have. It's no longer just about whether some cases remain unresolved. Government officers have already acknowledged that. The real question now is different. What are we actually being shown? What is being withheld? Who decides what gets released? Are these new UAP disclosure systems giving the public answers, or simply giving us better organized fragments? Today we examine the latest UAP disclosure news, the new UFO files, the glowing orb reports, the reported 1952 Washington recording, the UAP Science Advisory Council, the UAP Governance Board, AARO, and the growing fight over transparency. This is not just another UFO news cycle. This may be the next phase of disclosure. Welcome to UFO to UAP. I'm your host, Matt Tones, and today we're asking one central question. Is UAP disclosure finally accelerating, or is the mystery simply becoming institutionalized? Let's begin, but after you press that subscribe button. Thank you so much. For decades, the UFO topic moved in waves. A sighting would capture public attention, a witness would come forward, a newspaper would run a dramatic headline, government officials would respond, then, slowly, the story would fade. Roswell followed this pattern. The Washington, D.C. sightings followed this pattern. Project Blue Book followed this pattern. The Phoenix Lights followed this pattern. Even the modern Pentagon videos followed this pattern. Public shock, official response, limited disclosure, renewed debate, then uncertainty. But what we are seeing now feels different. The modern UAP issue is no longer moving only through isolated cases. It is moving through systems, file release systems, government databases, interagency boards, science advisory councils, AARO case reviews, congressional pressure, public records, declassification pathways. This is a different kind of disclosure environment. It is not one dramatic moment, it is a process. And processes matter because a process can reveal information, but it can also control information. That is the tension we're investigating today. The first major story is the continuing release of UAP records through the Presidential Unsealing and Reporting System for UAP Encounters known as Pursue. The official government site says the third tranche of records was released on June 12, 2026, following earlier releases in May. That matters because we're not looking at a single once-off drop. We're looking at a rolling disclosure structure. The files are being housed through war.gov/UFO, and the government has indicated additional files will continue to be released over time. On the surface, that sounds like a major win for transparency. For decades, the public has asked for government UFO files. Now, files are being released. But the deeper question is whether the releases are providing clarity, because releasing records is not the same as resolving cases. A file can confirm that something was reported, a video can show that something was seen, a document can reveal that an agency investigated something, but that does not necessarily tell us what the object was. And this is where UAP disclosure becomes complicated. The public often imagines disclosure as a vault opening. The door swings open, the truth comes out. But the reality may be messier. A file release can give us data without certainty. It can give us reports without conclusions. It can give us testimony without verification. It can give us videos without enough context. It can give us history without closure. And that appears to be exactly where we are. The Pursue releases are important because they show that UAP material exists across government records, but they also reveal the same problem that has haunted this topic for decades. The evidence is fragmented. Some files are interesting, some are ambiguous, some are historical, some are modern, some are heavily contextual, some raise more questions than they answer, and that may be the real disclosure story. Not that the government is suddenly revealing the truth, but that the government is now publicly revealing how incomplete the truth still is. A question for you. Do you think these new UFO file releases represent real transparency, or are they just controlled fragments designed to manage public pressure? Add your answer in the comments because this question sits at the center of the entire disclosure debate. Now, let's move to the most visually dramatic part of the latest news cycle, the Orb reports. The recent UAP file releases included reports and media connected to strange orb-like objects. Some are described as glowing, some red, some white, some plasma-like, some allegedly changing shape, some reportedly splitting into smaller lights. This is exactly the kind of material that captures public attention, because orbs are strange enough to be compelling but vague enough to be difficult to interpret. And that is the problem. A glowing orb in the sky can be many things: a drone, a balloon, a lantern, a sensor artifact, a distant aircraft, an atmospheric effect, a classified platform, a misperception, or something genuinely unknown. The word orb does not solve anything. It describes an appearance, not an origin. And that distinction matters because the UFO world often turns descriptions into conclusions. Someone sees a glowing orb, the internet turns it into alien technology. A file says object unresolved. The public reads that as extraordinary, but unresolved does not mean extraterrestrial. It just simply means unresolved. And yet we should not dismiss the reports either, because some cases appear to involve trained observers, some appear to involve repeated events, some appear to involve unusual motion, some appear in official records, some involve multiple witnesses, some involve government personnel, and that makes them worth examining. Not because they prove something extraordinary, because they reveal what modern UAP investigation is actually dealing with: ambiguous phenomena. Inconsistent data, unusual witness accounts, limited context, and a public eager for answers. This is where AARO's role becomes important. The All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office exists to help the US government address unidentified anomalous phenomena using a scientific and data-driven approach. But that mission is difficult when the available evidence is incomplete. AARO can only analyze the data it has. If a report lacks sensor metadata, its value is limited. If a video lacks range, speed, location, sensor type, and environmental conditions, its value is limited. If a witness account cannot be corroborated, its value again is limited. That does not make it meaningless, it makes it uncertain. And uncertainty is where the UAP mystery lives. The Orb files are a perfect example of the modern disclosure problem. They are compelling enough to demand attention, but not complete enough to deliver certainty. They are strange enough to keep the mystery alive, but ambiguous enough to resist clean conclusions. And that is why they matter. They show us that disclosure is not just about proving what UAP are. Disclosure is also about revealing the limits of what government systems can currently explain. Now, some listeners may ask, why are these Orb cases being released now? And that is a fair question. The timing matters. These releases are happening alongside the formation of new advisory and governance structures around UAP. That means the file releases are not happening in isolation, they are part of a broader shift. The government is releasing material. AARO remains active. A UAP Science Advisory Council has been reported. A UAP Governance Board has been discussed. Avi Loeb and other scientific voices are becoming part of the conversation. Congressional pressure continues. The public is watching. Put all of that together and a pattern emerges. UAP disclosure is no longer simply a question of whether a file exists. It is becoming a question of how files are processed, reviewed, interpreted, governed, and released. That is a major evolution. And it brings us to the second major story. The UAP Science Advisory Council and the UAP Governance Board. In recent episodes, we explored both of these developments in detail, but they also belong in this news episode because they provide the context for everything else. The Science Advisory Council represents the scientific layer. The Governance Board represents the control layer. The Science Council asks, what does the evidence show? The Governance Board asks, how should government agencies coordinate, classify, declassify, and respond? And that distinction is important because the future of UFO disclosure may not be determined by a single whistleblower, a single video, or a single dramatic hearing. It may be determined by process. Who controls the files? Who reviews the evidence? Who decides what is releasable? Who determines whether raw data can be shared? Who coordinates between the Pentagon, intelligence agencies, law enforcement, civilian agencies, scientists, and Congress? This is why governance matters. A UAP governance board could improve transparency. It could create interagency coordination. It could support AARO. It could streamline declassification. It could ensure better scientific input, but it could also centralize control. It could become another layer between the public and the evidence. It could manage the narrative. It could slow disclosure. It could protect agencies from embarrassment, or it could be all of those things at once. This is why we need to watch outputs, not announcements. What does the board actually produce? Do we get clearer case reports, better standards, faster declassification, public summaries, scientific analysis, more transparency around unresolved cases, or simply more structure with the same limited answers? That is the test. The government can create councils, it can create boards, it can create offices, it can create portals, but the public should judge those systems by what they reveal, not by what they promise. A question for you. Who should have the final say over UAP disclosure? Government agencies, independent scientists, Congress, or the public? Tell me in the comments because your answer says a lot about who you trust to handle the unknown. Now, let's move into the third major story. The reported 1952 Washington UFO recording. This is potentially one of the most fascinating historical disclosure developments in recent years. The Washington, D.C. UFO wave of 1952 is one of the most famous cases in American UFO history. Unusual radar returns, reports near the nation's capital, public concern, Air Force involvement, media attention, a government response during the early Cold War. The case became part of the historical foundation for Project Blue Book and the government's early UFO investigations. Now, according to recent reporting, Congressman Eric Burleson has discussed a long-sought recording tied to those 1952 events. The recording is reportedly connected to Air Force officials and scientists discussing UFO investigations from that era. If released, it could provide rare audio insight into how officials talked about UFOs during one of the most important moments in early federal UFO history. But we need to be careful. Report is not confirmed. A recording being discussed is not the same as a recording being publicly verified. A historical tape becoming available would not automatically prove extraordinary claims, but it could be historically significant. Because the most valuable part of such a recording may not be what it proves about UFOs, it may be what it reveals about government thinking. How do officials frame the problem? What explanations were considered? How seriously did they take the sightings? What role did Cold War anxiety play? Were they worried about Soviet technology, atmospheric phenomena, radar error, public panic, unknown aircraft, or something else? That is the kind of historical evidence that matters because UFO history is not only about what was seen, it is about how institutions respond. Roswell matters because of the shifting official story. Project Blue Book matters because of how cases were investigated and categorized. The Condon Report matters because of how it shaped the end of official UFO research. The 1952 Washington sightings matter because they occurred over the Capitol and triggered serious institutional attention. A recording from that period could help us understand the official mindset at a critical moment. That is why this story is important, not because it guarantees a smoking gun, because it may help fill the historical gap. And the historical record is where many UFO stories still live. This also connects directly to the current Pursue release. We are seeing modern files, historical files, audio, video, images, reports, government records. The disclosure landscape is no longer only about the latest sightings, it is about the archive. And the archive matters because it lets us compare official explanations across time. What did officials say then? What did they say later? What changed? What stayed hidden? What was classified? What was misinterpreted? What was minimalized? What was genuinely unresolved? Those are the questions that serious UAP research must ask. The public often wants one final answer, but sometimes the more important work is reconstructing the chain of institutional response. Because when we understand the response, we understand the system. And when we understand the system, we understand why disclosure has been so difficult. Now, let's step back. What do all these stories have in common? The new file releases, the Orb reports, the UAP Science Advisory Council, the UAP Governance Board, the 1952 Washington recording, AARO, Pursue, congressional pressure, public demand. They all point to the same reality. UAP disclosure is no longer a fringe demand. It is now an institutional process. That is a remarkable transformation. For decades, people ask whether the government would ever take UFOs seriously. Now, the better question may be, what does it mean now the government is taking UAP seriously enough to build systems around it? Because systems do not automatically equal answers. Systems can investigate, systems can classify, systems can release, systems can delay, systems can protect, systems can confuse, systems can clarify. Systems can centralize authority, systems can create accountability. The outcome depends on how those systems are designed and how much pressure the public applies. This is why the current disclosure news matters, not because one story solves the mystery, not because one orb file proves the extraordinary, not because one council guarantees scientific truth, not because one tape changes everything, but because taken together, these developments show that the UAP issue has entered a new phase. Disclosure is becoming procedural, scientific, bureaucratic, political, and public all at once. That is both promising and dangerous. Promising because the subject is no longer being ignored, dangerous because once a mystery becomes institutionalized, it can be managed, and managed disclosure is not the same as open disclosure. That phase matters. Managed disclosure. It means the public may receive information, but through filters, classification filters, national security filters, scientific filters, political filters, bureaucratic filters, communication filters. Each filter may have a legitimate purpose, but each filter also creates a distance between the public and the raw evidence. That distance is where distrust grows, and distrust has always been central to the UFO story. People do not simply wonder what is in the sky. They wonder what is being hidden. They wonder why explanations change. They wonder why files are redacted. They wonder why videos are blurry. They wonder why eyewitnesses come forward but data remains unavailable. They wonder why government officers acknowledge unresolved cases but rarely provide full public evidence. That is the credibility problem, and it cannot be solved by file releases alone. It requires process, standards, transparency, scientific review, public reporting, clearer language, and honest uncertainty. The public can handle not knowing. What the public struggles with is being told to trust a process that it cannot see. Question for you. Would you trust a UAP case more if it came from a government file release, a scientific review, a military witness, or independent civilian researchers? Put your answer in the comments because the future of UAP credibility may depend on how evidence is validated. Now we need to talk about what comes next. If the current disclosure trend continues, we should watch for several developments. First, the next pursue release. If records continue to be released on a rolling basis, the pattern of what is included will become important. Are we seeing historical files, modern military cases, high quality sensor data, or mostly ambiguous reporting? Second, the 1952 Washington recording. If it is released, it deserves a dedicated analysis, not as proof of aliens, as a historical record. Who is speaking? What are they discussing? What assumptions do they make? How does it compare to official explanations? Third, the UAP Governance Board. What does it produce? Does it issue public guidance? Does it coordinate declassification? Does it support AARO in visible ways? Or does it operate entirely behind the scenes? Fourth, the UAP Science Advisory Council. Does it lead to better standards? Does it recommend new instrumentation? Does it influence case review? Does it help define what quality UAP evidence should look like? Fifth, AARO's public communication. Will the official release more case data? Will it explain unresolved cases more clearly? Will it separate weak cases from strong ones? Will it give the public confidence in its methodology? These are the markers to watch. Not rumors, not hype, not dramatic claims, outputs, documents, methods, standards, release schedules, case quality, scientific review, public accountability. That is how we measure whether disclosure is real, because disclosure is not only about volume, it is about usefulness. 1,000 unclear files can create more confusion. One well-documented case with full sensor data can move the conversation forward. That is the difference. That is why the current moment is so important. The government appears to be releasing more, but the public must demand better. Better context, better metadata, better explanations, better scientific reference, better declassification standards, better acknowledgement of uncertainty, better separation between what is known, what is claimed, and what remains unresolved. That is the standard this subject deserves, because UFO disclosure has always suffered from extremes. Either everything is dismissed or everything is believed. The modern UAP era needs something better, a disciplined middle ground, open enough to investigate, skeptical enough to avoid false conclusions, serious enough to respect witnesses, scientific enough to test the claims, transparent enough to earn public trust, and honest enough to say when the evidence is not complete. That is where UFO to UAP will continue to focus, not on easy answers, not on sensational certainty, but on the systems, files, witnesses, science, and institutional decisions shaping what the public is allowed to know. As we close this episode, let's return to the central question. Is UAP disclosure accelerating? Yes, it is. The file releases, advisory structures, governance board, historical tape claims, and public pressure all suggest movement. But is UAP disclosure resolving the mystery? No, not yet. What we are seeing is not closure. We are seeing structure. And structure can be the beginning of truth or the architecture of control. That is why this moment deserves attention. The mystery has not disappeared. It has changed form. It is no longer just in the sky. It is in the files, the boards, the councils, the redactions, the release schedules, the archives, the data systems, the scientific systems, the classified channels, the congressional letters, the public pressure. The disclosure process itself has become part of the phenomenon, and perhaps that is the most important news of all. The UAP story is no longer just about what governments have seen, it is about how government decides what we get to see. Final question for you. Do you think UAP disclosure is moving toward truth or becoming more carefully managed? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to hear where you stand. This has been UFO to UAP. I'm Matt Tones. If you found this podcast valuable, follow the show, share it with someone interested in UFO disclosure, UAP news, government transparency, AARO declassified UFO files, and the future of the unknown. And remember, the question is no longer whether UFO files exist. The question is whether the files we are seeing are enough to reveal what has remained hidden.